Now, our discussion of miscegenation may make it appear that the Spanish were actually quite open-minded about natives and that they considered them more or less equals, but actually that's hardly the case. Let's remember that miscegenation, the promotion of it, was actually promulgated by Spanish administrators uh, in the aim of colonial settlements. So it was actually strategic. In fact, there became something known as the Black Legend. And what is this? The Black Legend, so to speak, uh, was this idea, this notion that Spanish in the New World, once, this became more into the public awareness in Europe, that the Spanish were indeed mistreating quite greatly the natives of the New World. Okay, and then, as we'll see, the French would try to depart themselves, part company from this idea of mistreatment, more or less. In any case, what happens about half a century later after Columbus is the so-called Valladolid debate, which takes place in Spain, the city of Valladolid, in 1850, and it involved two interlocutors, Las Casas and Sepulveda. Now, let's give a little background about these guys. Las Casas was a Dominican friar, and here's his picture right here. He was a Dominican friar who accompanied Columbus on his later voyages. Columbus made several voyages before his death. And Las Casas immediately noticed the mistreatment that was leveled upon the natives, especially as they were used for slave labor. And we discussed the encomienda system. Well, he protested against this. In fact, upon his return to Spain, he argued against the mistreatment of the natives, and indeed argued that they should be converted to Catholicism. Now, for some, it was not really clear in the Spanish mindset whether the natives were actually deserving of conversion, because they didn't know what to make of these people across the Atlantic. Some thought that they were inherently savage and could not be saved. They did not have souls, so to speak, that could be saved. So this gave rise to this great debate between Las Casas and Sepulveda. Now, who is Sepulveda? Sepulveda was a person who represented the interest of the encomienda owners, who profited off the labor of natives, and they were becoming tremendously rich. So he is defender of the encomenderos, to use that term, owners of the encomienda. So this debate was hatched in 1850. And in this debate, Las Casas argued that, again, the natives had a soul, right? That they were rational, and their soul could be saved by converting them to Catholicism. So Las Casas is arguing that what the Spanish was doing in their mistreatment was a grave sin, and what should happen instead is mass conversion of the natives. Now, Sepulveda, on the other hand, let's remember that he represented the encomenderos. Who are the encomenderos? The owners of the encomienda system, who are profiting greatly at the expense of native slave labor in the encomienda, or mining for gold and silver. So at stake here was something economic, which Sepulveda was defending. And in contrast to Las Casas, who claimed that the Indians should be saved because they're rational and because they had a soul, Sepulveda argued that the Native Americans, hey, just look at them, they're committing crimes against nature, so to speak. They practice cannibalism. They practice human sacrifice. They are uncivilized. They cannot be saved. They have no souls. In fact, they are indeed natural slaves. Okay. Now, how is this debate resolved? Well, it actually reached the ears of the Pope himself, who sided with Las Casas. And perhaps that doesn't surprise us, because we know that mass conversion will indeed take place. In fact, if you go to any part of Latin America, not to mention other places like the Philippines, predominantly Catholic. What's going on here, right? Another way to look at this from our perspective today is something called the social construction of race. And what does this mean? As indicated on the slide, this is the notion that race does not exist naturally, or, to use more modern terms, biologically. Rather, we create race. Human beings do. It is a social construction. This is something I alluded to earlier. Now, this may seem counterintuitive, because many of us still believe in race being a, quote, natural biological thing. But this is actually a misbelief, right? This misbelief argues that people with different skin color, black, white, quote unquote, red or yellow, what have you, are inherently different from each other. Okay, that's the origin of this notion of race. And moreover, the belief in race involves essentialism. What is essentialism? Well, the root word of essentialism is essence. And if you don't know what essence refers to, it refers to some characteristic or trait or property that is unchanging and permanent. For example, when you think about water, what is the essence of water? Well, one thing that's true about water is the presence of 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen molecule. So no matter what, whenever you encounter water, it has 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen molecule. And that's an unchanging and essential trait. It's permanent. Same with, for example, our discussion of triangles. No matter what, a triangle has 3 sides. Now, can you make the same attribution of permanent characteristics to people who belong to a particular skin color? Black, white, yellow, red, brown. No, you cannot. Okay, there's nothing essential, especially non-physical characteristics that became attached to the physical dimension of skin color. You know, in the construction of race in the past, well, look at this Sepulveda debate, right? Sepulveda is arguing that they're essentially savage, that they're essentially uncivilized, that they're essentially slaves. So he's arguing that these are unchanging characteristics. Now, Las Casas does not believe in that. He posits the fact that they are civilized, that they're rational, or they could be civilized, but that they're indeed rational, and they could be saved. They have a soul. That's something that's essential to them, just like any other human being, and therefore they could be converted to Catholicism. Okay, so what's happening here in this debate should be clear to you. They are constructing race. If you were a spectator at that time, you'd be witnessing the construction of race. Now, we'll encounter this event, or these events of social construction of race, in future discussions in this class. But here's a good entry point into this as it relates to early settlement by the Europeans in the New World and their encounter with the native inhabitants. Okay, so I mentioned that Spain led the way in terms of, quote-unquote, discovering and exploring the New World, but this would be followed closely by the French and, to a lesser degree, the Dutch. And then, as I also mentioned, the English would follow suit by the early 1600s. You probably noticed that the first permanent settlement of the English in the New World was Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. Now, what is motivating the French and Dutch to come to the New World? Well, we have to place primacy upon trade. Trade was the primary reason why the French and Dutch came to the New World. That's not to say there's no French priests and Jesuit priests in particular who wanted to convert the natives. There was a sizable number of them in the New World in North America, but nonetheless, France would end up, as I just mentioned, exploring parts of North America. And indeed, we probably know that there's a strong French presence in places in Canada like Montreal and so forth. This is the legacy of this French colonization. Now, when it came to the French encounter with the natives, they tended to be more or less more humane towards the natives. That's not to say there was completely a complete lack of mistreatment, but for the most part, they considered Native Americans as rational human beings, and that they were more or less equal to them. Okay, this sounds almost hard to believe, especially compared to the Spanish, but you actually see some French coexisting with natives in parts of North America. Now, an important part of this knowledge was gained by this historian named Richard White. Okay, Richard White wrote a book in, I believe, the 1980s called The Middle Ground. And here he uncovered this place, a part of North America near the Great Lakes region of, the Midwest, northern Midwest. And what he uncovered was this area whereby natives of that area, the Algonquin tribe to be particular, and the French actually forged this community and society whereby it was marked by coexistence. In fact, it actually thrived. Okay, and how is this possible? It was due to the fact that both sides, the French and the natives, dropped their suspicions of each other and began to forge this community. They based this on this outlook of, again, relative equality amongst themselves and mutual accommodation. Okay, so what does this show? It shows that this idea that conquest was inevitable, conquest of the natives, is actually misguided. And in fact, that's what indeed happens historically, but it didn't have to happen that way. To put it another way, conquest was contingent. It's a contingent fact in history. It could have been otherwise, right, to use our terms. And the middle ground proves this, okay? If both sides actually dropped their mutual suspicion cast towards each other and decided to work together, so to speak, then something new could have happened, right? A new emergent culture that would have replaced this tragic event of native displacement that happens. Okay, so this is why it's important to note this, that the middle ground disproves this idea of linear conquest, that conquest was indeed inevitable. And let's remember ideas of European exceptionalism. Some people believe this was the case because of the inherent superiority of European civilization, just subordinating and subjugating and subduing the natives. This did not have to happen, right? But if you believe in the European exceptionalist thesis, well, you believe that it was bound to happen no matter what because of the inherent superiority of the Europeans, right? But you could look at it from the other way in terms of subscribing to the linear conquest. You could just look at it apart from European exceptionalism and just say that, well, sure, they were superior military technology, the Europeans, but, this was bound to happen due to something like, economic imperatives, whereby, the beginning of capitalism would be such a tremendous force in the erosion of Native American societies there. And I'll talk about that more in the next slide.